The story of Majdanek begins in the summer of 1941, in the shadow of one of the largest military invasions in history. On June 22, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, its surprise attack on the Soviet Union. In just weeks, the Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of kilometers, capturing cities, villages, and millions of soldiers. By autumn, more than 3 million Soviet troops were in German hands. These prisoners of war were herded into open fields, deprived of food, water, and shelter. Thousands perished daily. The Nazi leadership, already committed to a war of annihilation in the East, began to consider how to use those who survived. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, saw an opportunity. He envisioned vast camps across occupied Poland where Soviet POWs could be held and exploited as slave labor. One such site was to be built near the Polish city of Lublin. The choice of location was strategic. Lublin lay within the general government, the central part of occupied Poland administered directly by Nazi authorities. It was a hub of roads and railways, easily connected to other major cities like Warsaw, Krakow, and Brest-Litovsk. The area also already had a large Jewish population, soon to be targeted in Action Reinhard, the plan to annihilate Polish Jewry. For Himmler and his planners, Lublin was ideal. Construction began in October 1941. The camp was first called Kriegsgefangenenlager der Waffen SS Lublin, prisoner of war camp of the Waffen SS Lublin. Its initial purpose was clear: to imprison Soviet POWs and use them for forced labor. Early plans projected space for 50,000 prisoners, but Himmler soon ordered this expanded to 125,000, even 150,000. These numbers were staggering, especially considering the already catastrophic death toll among Soviet captives. The site chosen was a flat expanse of fields near a suburb called Majdanek. Locals would soon call the camp Majdanek, Little Majdan, to distinguish it from the neighborhood. That name has endured. The first prisoners arrived even before construction was complete. They were Soviet soldiers, captured on the Eastern Front, marched into Lublin in rags. Starved, beaten, and diseased, they were set to work building their own prison, cutting timber for barracks, digging foundations, stringing barbed wire fences. The conditions were atrocious. Lublin's autumn rains turned the ground to mud. Winter brought freezing temperatures. The prisoners had no adequate clothing, no blankets, and little food. Disease swept through the work details. Dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia killed hundreds. Many collapsed while carrying logs or digging trenches. Survivors later recalled seeing bodies left in ditches or by the roadside, where they froze stiff before being hauled to mass graves. A Polish witness remembered watching the Soviet POWs pass through Lublin. They were no longer men, only walking skeletons. Their eyes were empty. They moved in silence. When they fell, the guards beat them, but many did not rise again. The people of the city watched, but we were powerless. By the end of the first winter, thousands of Soviet POWs had perished in Majdanek before the camp was even fully operational. Historians estimate that between 1941 and 1942, as many as 150,000 Soviet soldiers died in German captivity across the Lublin district, with Majdanek itself claiming countless victims. As construction continued, Majdanek's purpose began to shift. The camp was placed under the authority of the SS and soon redesignated Konzentrationslager Lublin, Lublin concentration camp. Unlike POW camps run by the Wehrmacht, Majdanek was now integrated into the SS system of terror and exploitation. Its physical layout reflected this. The camp was divided into sections, or fields, each with rows of long wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Administrative buildings housed the commandant's office, SS barracks, and storage facilities. Workshops and warehouses were erected to use prisoner labor. From the very beginning, Majdanek was not just a place of detention, but a machine designed to extract every ounce of labor before death. The camp's first commandant was Karl Otto Koch, previously commandant of Buchenwald. Koch had a reputation for brutality and corruption. Under his watch, Majdanek quickly gained notoriety for random executions, sadistic punishments, and theft on a massive scale. The prisoners at this stage were a mixed population. While Soviet prisoners of war remained the largest group, Polish political prisoners were also sent to Majdanek. These included members of the resistance, intellectuals, clergy, and anyone suspected of opposing German occupation. For Poles, Majdanek became one of the primary sites of terror in the Lublin district, a place where arrests often meant disappearance into the barbed wire. The transition from a POW camp to a concentration camp also meant the arrival of Jewish prisoners. By early 1942, as the Nazi regime began to implement the final solution, Majdanek was drawn into Action Reinhard. Trains carrying Jews from the Lublin ghetto and surrounding towns began to arrive at the camp gates. At first, many believed they were being sent to labor camps. The truth revealed itself brutally. Prisoners were registered, stripped of belongings, and herded into barracks. The confiscated property, clothes, shoes, suitcases, even wedding rings, was sorted in special warehouses. This theft was systematic, and Majdanek became a processing center for goods stolen from Jews across occupied Poland. Conditions for these new arrivals were catastrophic. Overcrowding, hunger, and disease claimed lives quickly. Typhus epidemics swept through the camp in 1942, killing thousands of inmates in just weeks. Entire barracks were quarantined. In some, every prisoner died. One survivor, a Polish Jew, recalled, "The lice were everywhere. We scratched until our skin bled. People lay in the bunks groaning with fever, their bodies burning, their eyes delirious. The dead lay beside the living, and there was no strength to carry them out." The SS command responded to these epidemics with even greater cruelty. Instead of providing medicine, they often simply increased killings. Prisoners judged too weak to work were taken away and shot. It was during these months that Majdanek began to develop its gas chambers, small but deadly rooms where Zyklon B pellets could be released. Thus, by late 1942, Majdanek had evolved. It was no longer merely a camp for prisoners of war or political prisoners. It had become part of the Nazi extermination system, a place where Jews, Poles, and others were murdered systematically through starvation, disease, shooting, and gas. From the very beginning, Majdanek's existence was tied to the larger Nazi plan of conquest and genocide. It was born of the invasion of the Soviet Union, fueled by racial ideology that saw Slavs, Jews, and political opponents as subhuman. Its construction was rushed, its operations chaotic, but its purpose was clear: to serve as both a tool of terror and a cog in the machinery of extermination. And yet, even in these first years, there were glimmers of resistance and humanity. Prisoners sometimes shared scraps of bread, whispered news from the outside, or sang songs to keep their spirits alive. One Polish inmate later remembered, "At night, in the barracks, someone would begin to sing quietly. Others would join in. For a few moments, we felt like human beings again." Majdanek was not yet at its deadliest in 1941 to 1942, but the foundations had been laid. The barbed wire enclosed thousands, the barracks filled with the sick and starving. The first gas chambers had been built, and the camp was already claiming lives by the thousands each month. For those trapped inside, the future was grim. For the city of Lublin, the smell of burning bodies was becoming familiar. And for the Nazi leadership, Majdanek was proving itself useful, a place where enemies of the Reich could be imprisoned, exploited, and destroyed. What began as a camp for Soviet POWs had become something far darker, one of the first concentration and extermination camps on Polish soil. Daily life in Majdanek was defined by one word: survival. Every moment, from the first light of dawn to the last exhausted breath at night, prisoners were confronted with the same question. Would they live through the day? The day began before sunrise. A siren would shriek across the barracks, and guards would bang on doors, shouting at prisoners to get up. The air was frigid in winter, stifling in summer. Prisoners scrambled to their feet, still half asleep, and rushed outside for appel. Roll call. Roll call could last hours. Prisoners stood in straight lines, 5 abreast, no matter the weather. Rain poured down, snow fell, winds cut through their thin clothing, but they were not allowed to move. If someone fainted, they were beaten or dragged out of line. If a prisoner could not stand, others sometimes held them up, risking punishment themselves. One survivor recalled, "We stood for so long that our legs shook. The guards counted and recounted us, shouting, beating with sticks. Sometimes they left us standing until midday. People collapsed. The dead were carried away and the living remained." After roll call, work assignments were given. For many, this meant forced labour outside the camp. Prisoners were marched in columns through the city of Lublin to dig ditches, build roads, or haul stones. Civilians watched them pass, some silently, some with pity, others with hostility. Inside the camp, prisoners worked in workshops repairing boots, weaving mats, or processing stolen property. The work was grueling and deliberately exhausting. Prisoners carried heavy stones until their backs broke. They dug trenches in frozen ground with bare hands. They stood at machines for 12 hours without rest. Guards struck them if they slowed, unleashed dogs if they stumbled. Food was meagre, designed to keep prisoners alive just long enough to work. In the morning, a thin cup of imitation coffee or watery soup. At midday, a bowl of cabbage or turnip broth, sometimes with a scrap of potato. In the evening, a piece of black bread, perhaps a sliver of margarine or sausage. The calories were far below what was needed for survival. Hunger was constant, gnawing, all-consuming. Prisoners dreamt of food. They searched trash heaps for peelings, chewed grass, or stole horse fodder when they could. A Polish political prisoner later said, "We spoke of bread as others speak of heaven." We described meals we had eaten before the war, dishes our mothers had cooked. For a moment, the hunger was eased by memory. But when we stopped speaking, it returned sharper than before. Hunger and labour combined with disease to devastate the camp. Typhus epidemics erupted in 1942 and again in 1943. Lice infested the barracks, spreading fever. Dysentery weakened prisoners until they could not rise from their bunks. Tuberculosis and pneumonia finished many. In some barracks, half the prisoners died in a single month. The SS treated disease with indifference or brutality. Instead of medical care, they often sent the sick to the gas chambers. Prisoners too weak to stand were loaded onto carts, told they were going to the infirmary, and taken instead to their deaths. Even those who reported sick at the camp's revier, the infirmary, faced danger. Doctors were often prisoner physicians, Jews or Poles forced to treat others without supplies. A survivor recalled, "The revier was not a hospital. It was a waiting room for death. The doctors had nothing, no medicine, no bandages. The sick lay on wooden planks. Many never came out again. Punishment was a constant threat. Guards beat prisoners with rifle butts, whips, or sticks for the smallest infraction, a missing button, a crooked line at roll call, a stumble during work. Prisoners were made to kneel on sharp gravel for hours, or to run until they collapsed. Some were hanged before the assembled camp as warnings. One prisoner testified after the war. A man stole a potato. They caught him. They beat him until he no longer looked human. Then they hanged him while we stood at appel. The SS shouted that this was what awaited all thieves. We watched, and we knew it could be any of us next. Women prisoners faced particular horrors. The women's camp at Majdanek held Jews, Poles, and Soviet women. They endured the same hunger, labour and disease, but also the cruelty of female overseers, the Aufseherinnen. These women, often in their 20s, wore SS uniforms and carried whips. They were notorious for sadism. Survivors described being beaten by female guards until their backs bled. Pregnant women were mocked and kicked. Children were torn from their mothers during selections. One woman later testified, "The Aufseherinnen laughed as they beat us. They were worse than the men. They knew we were defenseless." Children in Majdanek rarely survived. When transports arrived, children were often sent directly to the gas chambers. Some were used in medical experiments or killed in reprisal actions. A few, especially older teenagers, were put to work, carrying bricks or cleaning barracks, but most were murdered. A Polish child who survived remembered, "We were herded together like animals." My little sister cried. A guard grabbed her and threw her into a truck. I never saw her again. Despite the overwhelming cruelty, prisoners sometimes found ways to resist spiritually, if not physically. They whispered prayers, recited poems, or sang songs in the barracks. They shared scraps of bread with those weaker. They kept secret diaries on scraps of paper hidden in cracks in the walls. One Jewish prisoner wrote, "We live like shadows, but we try to remember who we are. We whisper Hebrew prayers. We share a crumb of bread. They want to erase us, but we still exist." Daily life at Majdanek was thus a cycle of hunger, labour, disease, and terror. But within this cycle, prisoners carved out tiny acts of defiance, a stolen moment of song, a hidden prayer, a shared glance of solidarity. For many, these were the only things that kept them human. The camp's very design reinforced dehumanization. The barracks were overcrowded wooden huts, long and narrow, with triple-tier bunks. The smell of sweat, excrement, and smoke filled them. Buckets served as latrines. In summer, the heat was unbearable. In winter, the cold cut to the bone. The prisoners wore striped uniforms, or at times whatever rags had not yet rotted. Shoes were precious. Many went barefoot, their feet wrapped in cloth. Hair was shaved upon arrival, leaving prisoners shorn and unrecognizable even to each other. Numbers replaced names. Each prisoner was tattooed or assigned a number worn on clothing. To the guards, they were no longer people but entries in a ledger, bodies to be counted, used and disposed of. A survivor later reflected, "They took our clothes, our hair, our names. They made us less than human. But inside I told myself, I am still me. They cannot take that." Over time, an underground hierarchy developed among prisoners. Some were appointed as capos, inmate functionaries who supervised others. Some capos were brutal, beating fellow prisoners to survive. Others tried to ease suffering where they could. The system sowed division and suspicion, making solidarity harder, yet sometimes it allowed tiny spaces for compassion. The fear of selections haunted every prisoner. At unpredictable intervals, the SS ordered inspections. Prisoners were lined up, stripped naked, and examined. Those deemed too weak, too sick, or simply chosen at random were sent to their deaths. One Polish survivor recalled, "We stood naked in the freezing wind. The SS walked among us pointing, left, right, left, right. We did not know which way meant life, which way meant death. Mothers clutched their children, but the children were taken anyway. When it was over, half of us were gone." Life in Majdanek was thus a constant struggle against forces beyond one's control. Hunger, disease, selections, beatings. Yet survival was possible, and those who lived through it carried memories etched into their bodies and souls. Inmates often spoke of luck. To survive, Majdanek required not only strength or will, but chance, being overlooked during a selection, finding a sympathetic capo, receiving a stolen potato, avoiding the eye of a guard. One survivor summed it up, "If you lived another day, it was because fate allowed it." There was no other explanation. For the people of Lublin outside the barbed wire, daily life was different but not untouched. They saw the prisoners marched through the streets. They smelled the smoke of burning bodies. Some looked away, afraid of German reprisals. Others tried to help, tossing scraps of food as columns passed. A few joined the underground, risking everything to smuggle news in or out of the camp. But for those inside Majdanek, daily life was stripped to the barest essentials. A struggle to stand, to breathe, to find a crumb of bread, to endure one more day. And beneath it all was the ever-present knowledge that Majdanek was not simply a prison or a labour camp. It was also a place of extermination. Behind the barbed wire, death was always waiting. In the gas chambers, in the crematoria, in the open pits. The routine of life in Majdanek, harsh and relentless, was itself a form of murder. Hunger, labour and disease killed more than bullets or gas. Inmates called it the slow death. Every day prisoners died where they stood, in barracks, in work details, in the mud of roll call. Yet every survivor of Majdanek carried the same truth. Within that machinery of death, some spark of humanity endured. It endured in whispered prayers, in songs hummed at night, in the hand of a fellow prisoner helping another to stand. It endured in the will to survive, not only for oneself, but for those who had already been lost. This was the daily life of Majdanek, a life suspended between death and survival, cruelty and compassion, despair and resistance. Majdanek was unique among Nazi camps. It was not only a place of forced labour, but also a site of systematic mass murder. Unlike Treblinka, Sobibor or Belzec, camps designed almost exclusively for extermination, Majdanek combined both functions. It served as a prison, a labour depot, and a killing centre. From the moment it was established, death defined the camp. Prisoners who arrived on transports often had no idea where they were being taken. Some believed they were being resettled, others thought they were being sent to labour camps, but for many, Majdanek was the last stop on their journey. At the edge of the camp stood the gas chambers, small, squat buildings with ordinary-looking doors, their true purpose hidden behind bland exteriors. Inside, they were fitted with sealed chambers, concrete floors sloped for drainage, and fittings for Zyklon B, or carbon monoxide gas. Survivors remembered the rumours that spread through the camp, whispers about people who entered those buildings and never came out. Prisoners saw smoke rising from chimneys, smelled the acrid stench of burning flesh, and knew what it meant. One survivor later testified, "We did not need to be told. We saw the people herded naked into the small rooms. We heard the cries. Then there was silence, and soon the smell came. That was how we knew. The system was chillingly efficient. Prisoners selected for death were told they were being taken to showers. They were ordered to undress, to leave their clothes neatly in piles. The deception was deliberate, to prevent panic, to keep the machinery of death moving smoothly. Once the doors were shut, Zyklon B pellets or bottled carbon monoxide gas was introduced. Within minutes, the chambers filled with toxic fumes. People gasped, clawed at the walls, collapsed. Death was not instant. It came with agony, with the sound of hundreds of bodies struggling for breath. Afterward, the doors were opened. Prisoners forced to work as part of the Sonderkommando dragged the bodies out. Gold teeth were pulled from mouths. Hair was cut from women's heads, later packed into sacks and shipped to German factories to be woven into felt and fabric. The bodies were burned in the crematoria or thrown into open pits. But gas chambers were only one method of killing. Mass shootings claimed tens of thousands at Majdanek. Prisoners were marched to trenches, forced to strip and shot in groups. The sound of gunfire echoed across Lublin. For civilians in the city, the reality of what was happening just beyond their streets could not be ignored. A Polish resident remembered, "We heard the shots all day. The sound carried across the fields. We saw the smoke rising. We knew people were being killed." The most infamous massacre in Majdanek's history was Action Erntefest, Operation Harvest Festival. It was the largest single-day mass shooting of Jews in the entire Holocaust. On November 3, 1943, the SS launched a coordinated action across the Lublin district. The purpose was to annihilate the remaining Jewish labor force. At Majdanek, the killings began at dawn. Prisoners were ordered out of their barracks and marched to prepared trenches just beyond the fences. The trenches had been dug days earlier under the pretense of air raid defense. In reality, they were mass graves. Loudspeakers blared music across the camp, German marches, waltzes, popular tunes. The music was meant to drown out the sound of gunfire, so that other prisoners would not hear the scale of the slaughter. Prisoners were forced to undress at the edge of the trenches. Groups were led forward, made to lie down in rows, and shot with machine guns. One layer of bodies was covered with a thin layer of soil, and the next group was brought forward to lie on top. The killing continued throughout the day. Survivors and witnesses described the horror. One said, "The earth moved." The wounded were still alive beneath the bodies. The SS kept firing, filling the trenches with layer after layer of the dead and the living. By nightfall, over 18,000 Jews had been murdered at Majdanek. Their bodies filled the trenches, stretching for hundreds of meters. Simultaneous massacres in nearby Trauniki and Poniatowa brought the death toll of Action Erntefest to more than 42,000. It was the single deadliest day of killing by German forces in the entire war, surpassing even the massacres at Babi Yar or in the Warsaw Ghetto. For those not taken to the trenches that day, the massacre was an unshakable memory. Prisoners in other parts of the camp recalled hearing the music, the gunfire, and the smell of blood and earth. One remembered, "We heard the shots without pause from morning until evening. We knew what was happening. We could not see, but we could smell the blood. The ground shook beneath us." The killing did not end with Action Erntefest. Throughout 1943 and 1944, executions continued. Sometimes entire transports were murdered upon arrival, never registered in camp records. Others were killed in reprisal actions, lined up and shot for resistance, sabotage, or simply as collective punishment. The crematoria at Majdanek worked constantly. Fires burned day and night, consuming the bodies of those murdered in the gas chambers, those shot in the fields, those starved or beaten to death in the barracks. When fuel was scarce, open-air pyres were built. Bodies were stacked like logs, doused with gasoline, and set alight. Prisoners in nearby barracks saw the flames, smelled the acrid smoke, and knew it was the fate that awaited them. One prisoner later testified, "The smoke was black. It hung over the camp. The smell was so strong it made us choke, but we could not look away. We knew it was our brothers and sisters burning." For the SS, killing became routine. Records were kept, tallies made, valuables collected. The machinery of death was bureaucratic as well as brutal. Gold from teeth was sent to the Reichsbank. Hair was packaged and shipped to German factories. Clothing from the dead was sorted, cleaned, and redistributed to civilians or the German army. The camp thus functioned not only as a killing centre, but as part of a vast economy of plunder. Even in death, prisoners were exploited. Their bodies were stripped not just of life, but of every possible material use. Yet amid this mechanized slaughter, individual acts of cruelty left deep scars. Survivors recalled guards who shot prisoners for sport, set dogs upon them, or forced them to crawl naked in the snow. Some SS men posed for photographs beside bodies, smiling as if on holiday. The extermination process at Majdanek was not hidden in the way it was at Treblinka or Sobibor. The camp stood on the edge of a major city. Civilians could see the watchtowers, the barbed wire, the smoke rising from chimneys. The smell of burning bodies carried for kilometers. This proximity to ordinary life made Majdanek distinct. It was not a secret killing center buried in remote forests. It was a death camp visible to thousands of people every day. A Polish farmer living nearby recalled, "We could see the camp from our fields. We saw the prisoners marched in columns. We smelled the smoke. We knew. Everyone knew." By 1944, as the Soviet army advanced, the pace of killings increased. The SS sought to eliminate evidence, but the camp was too large, too close to the front. Unlike Treblinka or Sobibor, Majdanek was not destroyed in time. When the Red Army liberated it in July, the gas chambers, crematoria, and piles of shoes and clothing still remained. But before liberation, thousands more perished in the final months. Prisoners were gassed, shot, or forced on death marches westward. The extermination at Majdanek was thus both systematic and chaotic, a combination of planned mass killings like Action Erntefest and daily acts of terror. The methods varied: gas, bullets, starvation, disease. But the outcome was the same: tens of thousands murdered, their lives erased in the machinery of genocide. Yet survivors carried the memory forward. One wrote after the war, "Majdanek was not only a place of death. It was a place where the world's silence allowed death to flourish. The smoke rose, and still the world did nothing." In the story of Majdanek, extermination was not hidden, not distant, but present for all to see. It was a warning written in smoke across the skies of Lublin, a warning the world would only fully grasp too late. Majdanek was not a machine that ran by itself. Behind the barbed wire and watchtowers stood people, men and women in uniform, carrying rifles, giving orders, choosing who would live and who would die. The commandants of Majdanek were SS officers, trained in brutality, steeped in ideology. Over the course of the camp's operation, 5 men held the position of commandant. Each left a distinct mark, but all shared responsibility for the suffering and death of tens of thousands. The first was Karl Otto Koch, infamous for his earlier role at Buchenwald. Koch was a man of corruption and sadism. He ruled Majdanek during its early construction in 1941. Under his leadership, the camp was built with speed and carelessness, using prisoner labor under harsh conditions. Thousands of Soviet POWs died erecting the fences, barracks, and watchtowers. Koch was later removed and executed by the SS itself, accused of corruption and embezzlement. But his brief tenure at Majdanek set the tone. The camp was to be run with ruthless efficiency, human life expendable, cruelty a tool of control. After Koch came Max Kogel, who had previously commanded Ravensbrück. Kogel continued to expand Majdanek, enforcing the brutal regime of labor and extermination. His time was short, but under his command the gas chambers began operating, and the camp's dual role as prison and killing site took shape. Hermann Florstedt followed. Florstedt was known for personal cruelty. Survivors recalled him beating prisoners with his own hands, setting dogs upon them, and ordering arbitrary executions. He enriched himself by stealing valuables from those murdered, sending gold and jewelry to his wife. Like Koch, Florstedt was eventually tried by the SS itself for corruption, a rare instance where Nazi internal discipline turned on its own. Not for murder, but for theft from the Reich. Martin Weiss and Arthur Liebehenschel were among the later commandants. Liebehenschel, who had earlier commanded Auschwitz, arrived in 1944, just before the camp's liquidation. Some survivors remembered him as less openly brutal than his predecessors, but the machinery of death continued under his watch. Beneath the commandants was a cadre of SS officers and guards. These men ran the daily operations, overseeing labor details, conducting roll calls, guarding watchtowers, manning the gas chambers. Many were young, in their 20s or 30s, products of the SS training system that fused military discipline with fanatical loyalty to Nazi ideology. For them, cruelty became routine. Prisoners were numbers, not people. Beatings were not crimes, but duties. Executions were carried out as casually as inspections. One survivor recalled, "The SS men laughed as they beat us. To them it was a game. They were young men, not much older than we were, but we were not human to them. We were bodies to be used. Perhaps most infamous at Majdanek were the Aufseherinnen, the female overseers who supervised women prisoners. Around 200 women served in this role during the camp's existence. They came from ordinary German backgrounds: secretaries, shop assistants, farmers' daughters. Yet in Majdanek they became instruments of terror. The names of some remain etched in survivor memory. Hermine Braunsteiner, later nicknamed the Stomping Mare, was notorious for kicking women and children with her heavy boots, sometimes to death. Survivors remembered her as merciless, tall and cold, her face expressionless as she inflicted pain. Braunsteiner emigrated to the United States after the war, living quietly in Queens, New York, until she was exposed in the 1960s and extradited to West Germany. She was later convicted for her crimes at Majdanek and sentenced to life imprisonment. Other overseers included Rosie Suess and Hildegard Lekert, nicknamed Bloody Brigitte for her savagery. Lekert beat prisoners with whips, fists and sticks, taking pleasure in their suffering. Survivors testified that she would force women to crawl in the mud, laughing as they bled. The presence of female guards shocked many prisoners. They expected cruelty from SS men, but the violence of women, especially against mothers and children, seemed to them a betrayal of basic humanity. A female survivor recalled, "We thought women might show compassion. Instead, they were worse than the men. They knew our weakness. They used it against us." The psychology of the guards at Majdanek reflected the wider SS worldview. Ideology and dehumanization allowed ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes. In the eyes of the perpetrators, Jews were not human beings. Poles, Soviet POWs, and other prisoners were subhuman enemies. Cruelty was not only permitted but encouraged as a way to demonstrate loyalty. Yet even within the SS, corruption was rampant. Guards stole valuables from murdered prisoners, pocketed money, traded in black markets. The SS itself prosecuted some for theft, showing that stealing from the Reich was treated more seriously than mass murder. After the war, accountability for Majdanek's perpetrators came slowly. The first trial of guards took place in Lublin in 1944, almost immediately after the camp's liberation. The Soviets and Poles staged it as a public reckoning. Survivors testified, evidence was presented, and several guards were sentenced to death and executed. But many perpetrators escaped justice for decades. Some blended back into German society, living quiet lives. Others emigrated abroad. It was not until the 1960s and 1970s that West Germany held major trials of Majdanek personnel. The most significant was the Majdanek trial in Düsseldorf, which began in 1975 and lasted 6 years. It was one of the longest war crimes trials in history. Survivors travelled from around the world to testify. They pointed at former guards, now old men and women, and described what they had done. The trial was grueling. The passage of time, the scarcity of surviving records, and the sheer scale of the crimes made prosecutions difficult. Out of dozens indicted, only a handful were convicted. Sentences were often lighter than survivors had hoped. Still, the trial marked a moment of public confrontation with the crimes of Majdanek. One survivor said during the proceedings, "I testify not for revenge, but so the world will know. These people thought they could forget what they did. We will not let them forget." The legacy of Majdanek's guards forces difficult questions. How could so many ordinary men and women participate in atrocity? How could people raised in families, educated, living in cities and towns, become executioners? Historians argue that ideology, obedience, and dehumanization were key. The guards were trained to see prisoners not as individuals, but as enemies of the Reich, as vermin to be exterminated. In such a worldview, cruelty became not only permissible, but praiseworthy. But survivors often put it more simply. They saw the guards not as monsters, but as human beings who chose to act monstrously. That choice, to kick, to whip, to shoot, was made again and again, every day. At Majdanek, the perpetrators left behind not only death, but also the memory of their laughter, their boots, their casual cruelty. Survivors remembered their faces, their voices, the sound of dogs barking, the echo of commands shouted in German. These memories testify to a truth, that genocide is not carried out by faceless machines, but by people. People who, in another life, might have been neighbors, shopkeepers, clerks. At Majdanek, they became killers. By the summer of 1944, the tide of war had turned. The Red Army was advancing westward, driving German forces out of Soviet territory and into occupied Poland. For Majdanek, this shift meant both chaos and opportunity. As Soviet troops approached Lublin, the SS began to panic. In most camps, the Nazis tried to dismantle evidence of their crimes before abandoning them. Treblinka, Sobibor and Belzec had already been destroyed, their structures torn down, their sites disguised as farmland. Auschwitz was in the process of being evacuated, its prisoners forced on death marches to the west. But Majdanek was different. The Red Army moved too quickly. In July 1944, the front line was only kilometers away. The Germans had no time to erase the evidence. They attempted hurried destruction. Some barracks were burned, documents were destroyed, prisoners were marched westward toward Auschwitz or other camps, leaving Majdanek eerily empty. But the camp was too large, too exposed. When the SS fled, they left behind not only the infrastructure of death, but also thousands of living prisoners and tens of thousands of unburied corpses. On July 23, 1944, the Soviet army entered Lublin. Within hours, they reached Majdanek. What they found was beyond imagination. The gas chambers still stood, their walls stained blue by Zyklon B. The crematoria were filled with charred remains. Piles of shoes, more than 800,000 pairs, lay stacked in warehouses. Silent evidence of lives taken. Barracks overflowed with clothing, hair, glasses, children's toys. Open pits brimmed with decomposing bodies. A Soviet war correspondent wrote, "It is impossible to describe the horror." The smell of death hung over everything. The chambers were filled with the last traces of the murdered. We walked through warehouses of shoes, mountains of them, each pair once belonging to a human being. The silence was unbearable. For the prisoners who remained alive, liberation was both joy and devastation. They had survived Majdanek, but their families were gone. Many had nowhere to return to. The moment of freedom was tempered by grief. One survivor remembered, "When the Soviets came, we did not cheer. We could not. We were too weak, too broken. We looked at them with hollow eyes. They gave us bread and we wept, not from joy, but from the memory of those who would never taste it." The Soviets acted quickly to publicize what they had found. Within days, journalists and filmmakers were brought to Majdanek. Photographs and newsreels captured the gas chambers, the crematoria, the piles of shoes. Unlike Treblinka or Sobibor, which left little physical trace, Majdanek was intact. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. This was the first concentration and extermination camp liberated by Allied forces. For the first time, the world could see, with its own eyes, the machinery of the Holocaust. The Soviet and Polish authorities staged one of the earliest war crimes trials in November 1944. 6 guards captured at Majdanek were brought before a public tribunal in Lublin. Survivors testified. Evidence was presented. The chambers, the crematoria, the mass graves. Tens of thousands of people crowded the square to witness the proceedings. The verdict was swift. The guards were convicted of crimes against humanity and executed. The trial was both justice and theatre, intended to demonstrate Soviet resolve and to expose Nazi barbarity to the world. Yet outside Eastern Europe, skepticism remained. In the West, some journalists doubted Soviet reports, dismissing them as propaganda. The scale of the crimes seemed too vast, the horror too unimaginable. One American journalist wrote in late 1944, "The Russians say they found a death factory near Lublin. They claim hundreds of thousands were murdered. It is difficult to believe. Perhaps it is exaggeration. Perhaps it is war propaganda. It would take the liberation of Auschwitz, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen months later to convince the wider world that Majdanek had been real and that the Soviets had not exaggerated." For survivors, liberation was the beginning of a new struggle. Many were alone. Families had been annihilated. Homes in Poland, Ukraine, or elsewhere were destroyed or occupied by others. Some survivors returned only to face hostility or renewed antisemitism. Others fled, joining streams of displaced persons across Europe. Majdanek itself became a site of memory almost immediately. The Soviets preserved parts of the camp as a museum, one of the first Holocaust memorials in the world. Visitors walked through the barracks, the gas chambers, the crematoria. They saw the piles of shoes and the ashes of the dead. But the Soviet narrative emphasized fascist crimes against all peoples, downplaying the specifically Jewish suffering at Majdanek. For decades, the story of the Holocaust was entangled in Cold War politics. Still, survivors insisted on telling their stories. Some wrote memoirs within months of liberation. Others testified in post-war trials. They described the roll calls, the hunger, the beatings, the gas chambers, the massacre of Action Erntefest. They spoke not only of death, but of resilience, the small acts of solidarity that allowed them to survive. One survivor wrote, "When we were freed, we thought the world would weep with us. Instead, many doubted, so we told our stories again and again, so that no one could ever say it did not happen." The liberation of Majdanek also revealed the scale of Nazi bureaucracy. Documents recovered from the camp listed transports, numbers, and possessions. The SS had recorded the murder of human beings as if balancing accounts. Shoes were counted, gold weighed, bodies reduced to statistics. For prosecutors at Nuremberg, Majdanek provided crucial evidence. Photographs of the camp were shown in court. Witnesses described the gas chambers. The camp became a symbol of Nazi atrocity, an early warning of the scale of the Holocaust. Yet for survivors, liberation was not an end, but a haunting. The images of death stayed with them. The smell of burning flesh lingered in memory. Nightmares followed them for decades. One man who survived as a teenager said later in life, "When I close my eyes, I still see the chimneys. I still smell the smoke. Liberation gave me life, but it did not take away the memories." In Poland, Majdanek became both a place of mourning and a political tool. The Soviets used it to condemn fascism and to legitimize their presence in Eastern Europe. Monuments were erected, ceremonies held, schoolchildren brought to learn about Nazi crimes. For Jews, Majdanek became one of the many sites of grief, part of the vast geography of loss that stretched from Warsaw to Auschwitz, from Treblinka to the forests of Belarus. Pilgrims came to say Kaddish among the ashes, to recite prayers where thousands had perished. The ashes themselves were gathered into a massive concrete mausoleum built in the 1960s. Beneath its dome lie the remains of tens of thousands, a grey mound of human dust. An inscription reads, "Let our fate be a warning to you." This memorial transformed Majdanek into one of the most powerful Holocaust sites in the world. Visitors walked the paths where prisoners had marched, entered the barracks, and stood before the ashes of the dead. The presence of the camp itself, preserved, tangible, undeniable, made it impossible to dismiss. For the world, the liberation of Majdanek marked the beginning of understanding. It was the first glimpse of the Holocaust as a system, not just as scattered atrocities. It revealed that genocide had been industrial, bureaucratic, and systematic. But it was also a reminder of failure. For years, the smoke of Majdanek rose over Lublin. Civilians smelled it. Prisoners smuggled out messages. Resistance fighters tried to warn the Allies. Yet the world had done little until the Red Army arrived at the gates. The aftermath of Majdanek thus carried a dual legacy: justice and denial, memory and silence, liberation and loss. Survivors carried their stories into the future, determined that what they had endured would not vanish into forgetfulness. One of them wrote, "I walked out of Majdanek alive, but I did not leave it behind. It walks with me, in every step, in every breath. My freedom is bound to their silence. I speak because they cannot." The story of Majdanek did not end with liberation in July 1944. The barbed wire remained, the gas chambers stood, the crematoria still held ashes. The camp became not only a crime scene, but also a memorial, a place where history, grief, and memory converged. Almost immediately after the war, Majdanek was transformed into a site of remembrance. In 1944, while the war still raged, the Soviets and the newly installed Polish Committee of National Liberation declared the camp preserved as a monument. It was one of the very first Holocaust memorials in the world. Unlike Treblinka or Sobibor, which were erased, Majdanek was left standing. Visitors could walk through its barracks, see its gas chambers, stand before its crematoria. This immediacy made Majdanek unique. Survivors returned within months to bear witness. Locals came to see what had been hidden in plain sight for years. Journalists, soldiers, and diplomats toured the grounds. For many, the sight of intact extermination facilities was overwhelming. A Soviet correspondent wrote in 1944, "Here is the evidence of fascist crimes, preserved in wood and stone, in ash and bone. No one can deny it, for it stands before our eyes." But memory was never simple. In the early years, the Soviet narrative emphasized Majdanek as a symbol of fascist barbarism against many peoples: Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Jews. The specifically Jewish dimension of the genocide was downplayed, subsumed into a broader story of anti-fascist struggle. This did not erase the Jewish memory of Majdanek. Survivors, rabbis, and Jewish communities visited, prayed, and wrote. They remembered the transports, the gas chambers, the massacre of Action Ernstfest, the destruction of families. But for decades, Jewish mourning existed in tension with official narratives. By the 1960s, Poland built a monumental memorial at Majdanek. The centerpiece was a massive concrete dome, beneath which lay a mound of human ashes collected from the campgrounds. The inscription read, "Let our fate be a warning to you." Visitors climbed steps to gaze into the vast mound of grey dust, the remains of tens of thousands. For many, the sight was unbearable. Survivors stood in silence, tears streaming down their faces. Schoolchildren gaped at the immensity of the loss. Foreign delegations bowed their heads. The ashes, once hidden in pits and furnaces, had become a visible, undeniable reminder of genocide. Yet memory also evolved. During the Cold War, Majdanek was used by the communist government of Poland as a tool of legitimacy, a symbol of Nazi crimes that justified Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. State ceremonies were staged, speeches delivered, wreaths laid. For survivors, these politics often felt distant. Their memory was not of ideology, but of suffering. They remembered hunger, selections, gas chambers, the endless roll calls. They remembered faces, voices, the sound of boots on gravel, the cries of children. One survivor wrote decades later, "They built monuments, they gave speeches, but for me, Majdanek is not concrete and stone. It is the barrack where I slept, the pit where they shot my brother, the shoe I saw that looked like my mother's. That is my monument." In the West, Majdanek entered public consciousness slowly. News of its liberation had been met with skepticism, dismissed by some as Soviet propaganda. Only after the liberation of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen and Dachau in 1945 did the scale of the Holocaust become widely accepted. Still, Majdanek played a role in the Nuremberg trials. Photographs and films of the camp were presented as evidence. Witnesses testified about the gas chambers, the crematoria, the piles of shoes. Majdanek became a symbol of Nazi crimes, a shorthand for the horror of concentration camps. Over time, more survivors published memoirs. Some wrote in Yiddish or Polish immediately after the war. Others, decades later, in English, Hebrew, or German. Their voices carried the memory of Majdanek across continents into classrooms, libraries, and homes. But memory was not uncontested. In the decades after the war, Holocaust denial emerged, fueled by anti-Semitism and conspiracy. Denialists claimed that Majdanek's gas chambers were fabrications, that the piles of shoes were staged, that the Soviets exaggerated numbers. For survivors, these lies were salt in unhealed wounds. They had lived the reality. They had smelled the smoke, seen the killings, carried the dead. To have their truth denied was a second violence. Historians and educators fought back with evidence. The records of Majdanek, preserved by both Nazis and Soviets, were overwhelming. The physical remains of the camp stood as silent testimony, and the voices of survivors, recorded in testimonies and interviews, provided irrefutable human witness. Today, Majdanek remains one of the best-preserved Holocaust sites in the world. Visitors can walk the paths prisoners walked, enter the barracks, stand inside the gas chambers. They can see the crematoria with their furnaces, the warehouses of shoes, the guard towers rising over the fields. School groups arrive from across Poland and beyond. Jewish delegations come from Israel, the United States, and Europe to recite Kaddish and lay wreaths. Scholars study the camp's records, piecing together the stories of those murdered. The impact on visitors is profound. Many describe the silence of Majdanek as the most haunting. The wind moving through barbed wire, the emptiness of the barracks, the vast fields where thousands once stood. Unlike museums that reconstruct or symbolize, Majdanek itself is the artifact. One visitor wrote, "At Majdanek, history is not in books or glass cases. It is under your feet, in the air you breathe. You feel the presence of those who suffered here. You cannot leave unchanged." The memory of Majdanek is also preserved in education. Teachers use survivor testimonies, photographs, and films to bring its history to students who were born generations later. Documentaries and books retell its story, ensuring that the name Majdanek remains known. For Jewish communities, Majdanek is both a place of mourning and resilience. Survivors' families visit to honor those lost, lighting candles, saying prayers. The camp stands as a symbol of destruction, but also of survival, proof that even in the face of annihilation, life endured. In Poland, Majdanek is part of a broader landscape of memory, alongside Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other sites. It serves as a reminder not only of Nazi crimes, but also of the human capacity for cruelty, indifference, and, at times, courage. Internationally, Majdanek underscores the importance of early evidence. Because it was liberated intact, it provided undeniable proof of genocide when the world might otherwise have doubted. That fact makes it a central case study in genocide prevention, showing how immediate exposure can shape historical memory. Yet the legacy of Majdanek is not only historical, it is ethical. The camp raises questions that remain urgent. How could ordinary people become executioners? How could neighbors remain silent as smoke rose over their city? How can societies guard against the ideologies of hate that make such crimes possible? For survivors, the legacy is deeply personal. Many lived with guilt, guilt for surviving when others did not, guilt for moments when they could not help. Yet they also carried pride, pride that they endured, that they testified, that they ensured Majdanek would never be forgotten. One survivor in his final testimony said, I am old now. I will soon join those I left behind at Majdanek. But I have spoken, and others will speak after me. As long as one person remembers, they will not have died in vain. Today, the grounds of Majdanek stretch quiet under the Polish sky. Grass grows where prisoners once stood for roll call. The watchtowers are still. The barracks are empty. But the silence is not emptiness. It is presence, filled with memory. Visitors walk slowly, whispering. They touch the wooden bunks, the cold stone of the gas chamber walls, the rusting barbed wire. They gaze into the dome of ashes and feel the weight of history pressing down. Majdanek's legacy is not only the memory of atrocity, but the warning it carries. The inscription beneath the mausoleum speaks to all who enter. Let our fate be a warning to you. It is a warning against hatred, against indifference, against the dehumanization of others. It is a call to remember that genocide is not inevitable, but the result of choices made by guards, commandants, bystanders, and leaders. The story of Majdanek is a story of loss beyond measure, but it is also a story of resilience, of survivors who carried memory forward, of educators who teach, of visitors who bear witness. In that resilience lies its ultimate legacy, that the silence of the murdered has been broken by the voices of the living, and that Majdanek, once a place of death, endures as a place of remembrance and warning for generations to come. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people hear and remember these stories.